25 years in the Air Force for me, but people say that teaches you nothing about being in the military, but there we are. So my name's Ray Locke. I'm Chief Executive of the Forces in Mind Trust, whose plastic bags you are very welcome to take away. We won't charge you £5 for them. Thank you very much for coming. I know conference is a long thing, and I'm afraid the aircon's not working in this room, so it's going to feel a little bit longer, but we're all together for an hour to talk about tackling disadvantage for the armed forces community. Quite rightly you would say, why is a charity funding an event like this? Well, it's very simple. We published together with our friends in the Local Government Association last year, and we've just republished this year a second edition of our Community Art Covenant. The role of the Forces in Mind Trust is to present evidence, credible, independently generated evidence to policymakers and service providers, and we have a room full, by the looks of things, of policymakers and service providers. So that's fantastic for me, as you can imagine. If I can also highlight, there's a contact card for Forces in Mind Trust. A couple of my staff, Tina, our comms officer, and Mary, my head of policy, is around today as well. So if you want to follow up about the Forces in Mind Trust, please fill this in or just come and see one of my team. So if I can just introduce our speakers today, and first of all, we're very delighted to welcome the Minister for Veterans and some other things, but here today primarily with veterans, Tobias Ellwood, who in his relatively short time in office has been a great supporter of the Forces in Mind Trust. To the right of me, as you look at me, Izzi Seccombe, who is the leader of Warwickshire County Council, and you will find her glowing introduction in this report because she was very much part of bringing this whole report together. On your far left, Semon from Business in the Community, who again has worked very closely with the Forces in Mind Trust to try and help corporate support to the Armed Forces Covenant. And then finally, Ed Boyd on your far right, who is the Managing Director of the Centre for Social Justice. And in our activity report from last year, you will find there is a picture of a launch we did of a report that again we funded with CSJ, and that was all about families' support to transition. So I hope you agree, we've got a fantastic panel. I'm not going to say anything more other than to sort of choreograph proceedings. I'll invite the panelists to say a few minutes about the topic, you know, is there disadvantage, and if so, how can we tackle it? And then we'll open the floor and hopefully have an interesting debate. So, Tobias, can I invite you to speak first?
Also, thank you very much indeed, and despite this not being on the main campus, it's wonderful to see that the room is completely full, and that shows, I think, the commitment that the Conservative Party, but indeed Britain actually has to our veterans. It's a real privilege to do this portfolio. I was in the Armed Forces myself, in the Royal Green Jackets, now the Rifles Regiment, and I'm now a Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves. So I've come into the MOD understanding the lexicon, which I have to say can be troublesome for other ministers if you've not served a little bit, the mentality, the culture, but also the commitment that our armed forces give. I think we can proudly say that we have the most professional armed forces in the world. It may not necessarily be the biggest, but it certainly is the most professional. If you speak to any of our NATO allies, you ask them which country they would like to have next to them when they go into battle, when they go into operations, when they go into exercise, it is Great Britain. And that is because of the length and breadth of time that we've been doing operations, the commitment we have, and also the alternative thinking that we bring to any situational awareness. So it's a real honour to be joining the team along with Mark Lancaster, along with, and also who did the job before me, and indeed with Michael Fallon, who's literally just spoken, and I think many of you may have heard him speak with passion and commitment about our armed forces as well. But they don't always stay in uniform, they don't always stay in the reserves. There comes a time when some of them decide to pack up their uniform, slide it back across to the quartermaster and say, I now want to go and be a civilian. And we need to recognise that the job that we've asked them to do, often putting themselves in harm's way, is quite different from other aspects of life and other aspects of the civil service as well. And the nation is beholden to them and has a duty of care, not just whilst they're in uniform, but for the rest of their lives. Now, as you all know, you're very familiar with this, 2.5 million veterans in the UK. Many of them make the transition into civilian life without any problem whatsoever, but some don't. And some of the scars might be visible, some of them might not be so visible. And that's where the nation has a duty collectively to make sure that they are looked after. And the model that we've developed here in the UK, which is different to other countries around the world, is that we have other departments which are emboldened and strengthened to provide that support, whether it be through local government or indeed through the National Health Service, also indeed through associations, regimental associations, and indeed the charity sector as well. Combat Stress, for example, actually has contracts with the NHS to look after various aspects of mental health support that we provide to our veterans. But in coming into this job, I recognise that one of the things that is concerning is the communication. If an individual does find themselves requiring help because they're homeless, requiring help because they are jobless, requiring help because they are starting to begin to be affected by mental health issues, where do they turn? And there are over 450 charities in the UK. There are 20 big charities that dominate 80% of the market, if I can put it that way, but many smaller charities as well. And if you are looking for help, if you've never required it before, and let's not forget, this is still remains a very macho environment where putting your hand up and saying, I need help, can be quite tricky for some of these people. Where do you turn to? And so I was delighted that one of the first jobs that I had was to go to the launch of the Veterans Gateway portal. And this is an online and telephone construct, which means that all the main charities are able to be represented. You simply call or get in touch through this portal, and you gain advice as to where you then go and where you then can seek that actual help and that advice. Now, it's in its infancy, it needs to develop and advance, and we hope that that will actually be the case. We need more charities. There's about 30 charities or so that are bought into this. We want more to do so as well. But I sometimes balk at the stories that when somebody is rolled out because they are found behind the dumpster and it's identified as being ex-military, why aren't we doing more to help that individual? There isn't enough support from the government. Actually, the support is there in huge amounts. It's important that they learn and we help let them know what is the process to receive that support. And that is my ambition, to make sure that that becomes more qualified and becomes more clearer. So how do we then also make sure that they're looked after in the longer term? Well, our veterans community leave the armed forces with a myriad of skills, and these are transferable skills. But again, does our workforce, do our companies, are they fully aware of how they could utilise, the sergeant major, how they could utilise the engineer that's on board a ship, or how that they could utilise the officer that comes having dealt with really pressurised situations. So again, we need to better educate our companies, the industries out there, to say, take a look at these people. Not only in general, but specifically, here are some names of people that might be attracted to you. So I'm pleased that the Armed Forces Covenant, which is this bond, as you know, this relationship between the government and the nation to look after armed forces, to make sure they're not actually disadvantaged, has a huge chapter which is devoted to encouraging businesses to actually recruit more veterans. Now, I was in Washington, DC last week, and I met David Shulkin, who is the Secretary for Veterans Affairs. And as you know, they have a different model over there. They don't have the NHS service that we have, so they have veterans hospitals, they have veterans health services. It's all done under his umbrella. But what he did say was that any business, defence business, seeking government contracts have to employ 7.5% veterans. Now, I thought that was quite interesting. And I'm looking at this as to how we can actually take advantage of that. So getting veterans to work in businesses, I think, is very, very important. Another part of this covenant is also to recognise that actually there are services that you could give to show your commitment to veterans as well. What discounts could you provide as well? Now, companies have come back to actually say, we need to recognise who is a veteran. How do you actually determine what that is? Because sadly, there are some automatics that go around at remembrance services with a opteric gong, and then also one from the Somme, and then one from the other battles as well. You simply couldn't have been on all those places. So we do need to have a method that actually allows us to make sure that we can identify who exactly is a veteran. And I'm pleased that Chris Grayling and I are in talks to place a symbol on your driving licence, So he actually made a joke about replacing the EU flag with this. With that. We won't go down that avenue. Last time I touched on that subject. But the idea then that we actually were able to identify who it is and then encouraging businesses to be able to then come forward. I make this observation because it gives you a direction of where I'd like to go. The passion and the reverence and the respect that I think Britain shows its armed forces is to be seen and is very, very clear and very profound, and is no different to what we see in America. But what you see in America is a different way that they practically show that support. It is on a different scale, and partly because of their structures as well. We go into any airport and you'll find a lounge that is dedicated to veterans. Now, how easy it would be to go to one of these big companies, a 200 company, and say, if you want to show your commitment to the covenant, sponsor this, sponsor that particular room, allow our veterans the place to actually then go in and then be looked after in that way. So that's the thinking that I'm putting there, to actually try and encourage companies to do that. Now we have to look after the armed forces personnel as well. So companies need to be able to give members of the reserve, like myself, time off. And many companies are now doing that. There's a bronze, silver and gold covenant award that companies now get, and there's almost 2,000 of them, to show their commitment to the covenant. Other companies, let's say like Vodafone, have removed the cancellation punishments, the fees that you pay when you have to suddenly close a contract down because you've suddenly been posted, let's say, abroad. And these are all good ways in which companies can actually support. British Airways gives 10% off flights for veterans. Most people don't even know that. So I've been doing my best, I don't know whether the BA likes that or not, to promote that, because that is a great way to show, again, our commitment and our respect for those that we put in harm's way. So these are great examples of what we need to do more of, but also advertise what we're doing. But when we're talking about the disadvantaged, we must also bear in mind where the scars actually come from. And one of the big areas, the biggest area I have to say, is the mental health aspect. And again, I was pleased to launch the new mental health strategy, because there is a stigma in the armed forces. You know, if a footballer has a knee injury, he just points to the knee injury and says, I can't play. And everybody accepts that. And likewise in the armed forces as well. But if you have the muscle, the brain, is actually suffering from an injury of some form, they don't put their hand up so easily. They don't, because of the stigma and so forth. Will it affect my progression, my promotion prospects and so forth, because I'm seen as weak? And we need to break through that. We need to actually say, it's very possible that you could be affected by the trauma that you see, which is so different to what other people do in their daily walks of life. So we have the first one, which is education, to make sure every platoon sergeant, platoon commander, company commander is speaking to their people to say, if you have an issue or a problem or something, no problem in actually coming forward, let's solve it so you can get back in the ranks far faster than allowing it to incubate and then cause bigger problems down the line. So education is the first one. Then prevention is, what can you actually do? Ultimately, there are ways you can be seeing things to desensitize or be aware and deal with the mental scars that you otherwise might accumulate. So education, prevention, and then it's detection to make sure you can then see what's going on, pluck them out, and then finally one, which is curing it there and then, or whilst they are actually in the armed forces. A very different process, dare I say, from the way it was in yesteryear, where basically you just held on to this inside. It accumulated and accumulated. You then felt pressure to say, I can't handle this anymore, let's get out of the armed forces. And then slide it across to the charitable sector or the NHS to then deal with that. So we're going back down the chain to see what we can actually do to help people whilst they're actually serving, as well as when they actually move forward as well. So I hope I'll stop there, because there's many other ideas, and I'm very passionate about this portfolio. But I have huge respect for our armed forces, but I do believe we need to do far, far more on educating people as to what exactly is out there, as well as advancing some of these programs. Thank you very much indeed.
Tobias, I'd like to invite Izzi to speak.
Thank you, Ray, very much, and thank you too to the Minister for such a really enthusiastic and inspiring start. And I'm really pleased there are so many here. Since 2011, when the Armed Forces Covenant came into play, local authorities have done a huge amount actually in taking up the enthusiasm to sign up to the covenant and to do their best to try to improve the life and opportunities for those who are leaving service and for their families. I think we mustn't forget there's some real pressures on families as well. Since 2011, we've seen over 1,300 UK organisations take up the pledge, and there are over 150 Covenant champions, which is fantastic news. So we are raising awareness. I'm always sure that we should just keep on and keep the information going, because it's easy to drop these things off. But there are some particular things that the LGA have been particularly pleased to do with Forces in mind. So we've got the document that we've jointly done, which has been a real step forward to try to explain to local authorities and other organisations how they can be part of supporting those in their community who have left the forces, and how they might try to identify them as well. I mean, it's quite interesting, in Warwickshire we have a sort of shared covenant, which is a Coventry, Solihull and Warwickshire, and the interesting thing around that is that Warwickshire has two bases, one in the north and one in the south. Solihull and Coventry don't have those, and it's quite challenging and quite difficult for them to identify those in their communities who are ex-servicemen. But of course ex-servicemen will, and women, will go anywhere. You know, they will want to live anywhere they can. So it's quite important that if you haven't got that resilience in your own area, that actually you work with those in your neighbours to try to identify that. And I think what we've identified through the work we've done together is there are 4 particular areas that we need to help and support our servicemen, men and women. And I'll just quickly explain. There's housing, there's schools admissions, employment and health. And I think also we should recognise the sort of scale of the issue before us. About 38% of armed forces personnel feel that they have been disadvantaged once or more than once through one of these areas. And I think that's quite a significant number, and probably rather disappointing as well. So on housing, I think it's quite an interesting thing too, particularly in areas where you've got bases. It's quite a challenge for local authorities to meet the needs of those coming out of the forces, and particularly to address their needs when there's local housing pressures for their own communities anyway. It is very difficult, but I think we need to reflect that sometimes the people who are leaving the forces are in a catch-22 situation. They need a house to get a job, and they need a job to get a house. And frankly, we need to help them to address that. And there are those authorities that are going the extra mile to help to resolve that. In Plymouth, particularly, we've got the Plymouth Council, for example, ex-armed forces personnel with medical conditions caused by their service are automatically given the property. And there are those authorities who are really making that big life-changing step for our personnel. And schools admissions, this is really looking at the challenges to some of the families. Tobias talked about mental health and how difficult that can be. It's actually difficult for the sufferer, but actually very difficult too for family who are trying to support them. Family who might not be close to their own personal network of support, who actually have to be resilient themselves without the skills, without the capacity to do that, and two, without that network of family that the forces provide and have always provided. And I think it's really difficult for families who move out of that wider work of the armed forces to actually step up and take on these challenges themselves. There are opportunities for children to go to schools and to have some extra support. And they have to be identified. And sometimes that's not what they want to be. Actually, most children just want to be invisible, just part of the same network of support, their peer group, and they don't want to stick out of the crowd. So I think we have to be sensitive to some of those challenges. In Wiltshire, the council has developed a stronger relationship with the military bases. This is to enable more joined up approach to the delivery of the covenant. Bases in Wiltshire, and they have a massive number of bases, and of course they've been really challenged by the rebasing from Germany as well. But bases, that council awareness makes the future admissions to schools so much more easier and smooth for their families. Employment is another challenge that we have to try to help, and the armed forces can also face disadvantages when they're looking for employment. You'd think they actually come out of it with fantastic skills, real resilience too, but actually, you know, to go into civvy life and to actually take that step change is quite a challenge. And you know, that support that you've had in the service network isn't always there, and it can be quite a lonely place. So I think we need to be aware of that, and that awareness will help us to provide that level of support. And finally, health. There's no doubt, you know, Tobias has talked about mental health problems. Obviously, we have issues around access to dental health, access to general health. It's vitally important that we provide that simply and freely to get the network of support that these you know, really great people who have done a wonderful job for us as society need to take them and just smoothly transition back into civvy life. It is important, the hidden problems that we have with mental health that we know, and I'm really pleased that the Conservative government have raised this over the last few years, but it's very important that that resilience is in place. And I have to say, it is very challenging at a time when we find in local authorities our budgets are increasingly squeezed, to put these forward as priorities. So we in the local authority world wanted to help our armed forces personnel. We need to make sure that we do, because the alternative is not an acceptable, morally not acceptable, and affordably not acceptable. So we need to make sure that we provide that network of support, and are asking the local government, and part of our submission in the budget submission this year will be that we are properly funded so that we can put the councils into a resilient position to support those vulnerable people in our society.
Thank you, Izzi. So, a campaign sermon for business in the community.
Okay, so let me try not to repeat what anyone else has already said, so let me take a slightly different tack at this. Last time I spoke for Forces in My Trust, a gentleman stood up at the end to ask a question, and he basically introduced himself as saying he was in the infantry for 13 years, which he said in itself is probably a form of legal discrimination if you try and find work in a CV. He said he was also dyslexic. But when he came out of the forces, he was supported to undertake quite a lot of training, and he actually undertook a number of courses that got him qualified to degree level in kind of management studies. He said, but he's working for, and I think they probably remember, so I won't name and shame them, but working for a retailer in a role that is completely suboptimal for his skills and his experience and his life experience, and really quite depressing. And on that basis, for me, that is just the big reminder and the wake-up call, whatever it is that we need, the kick up the backside maybe, to say we really need to do something differently about this, about veteran employment. Undoubtedly, a large number of people transition smoothly, and people have talked about that. Undoubtedly, a large number of people transition into employment, and therefore, from a statistics perspective, might look okay. But actually, I think there are an awful lot of people, like the gentleman I talked about, who transition into underemployment and really aren't in employment that is commensurate with their skills and experience, or, and this bit I think is much harder, actually an employment that they find is fulfilling in any way near the level of experience that they had in the service and that sense of vocation. So I think we're a really, really long way from sorting that out. And equally, and undoubtedly, there are also a minority of people who really struggle to make that transition. And that's either people who've been directly affected because of their service or indirectly affected actually in terms of some of the work that Forces and Mine Trust have done and others around identifying challenges for spouses in terms of recruitment, often having quite significant gaps in their CV as they've kind of supported their partner in the services and therefore they're looking for employment. So when I look at this challenge, I think that I see that the MOD do an enormous amount, actually more than any employer I could name, and I love lots of employers, but they do more than any to support people who are leaving. And I think that's phenomenal. But I see an awful lot of recommendations, an awful lot of attention go to support the individuals. And worthy as that is, I think it misses the point slightly. Because employers really, really stand to gain from the skills and the talents and the experiences of people who've served. And I don't see them doing enough to make it easy to kind of open the glass door that exists for many veterans when they leave and to put down a welcome mat that helps them when they arrive. So we've been working with a number of our members. We're a charity with over 800 companies and membership, supporting them to be more responsible businesses, to really understand from those that are doing this well, why are they doing it, what can we learn from them, and how can we encourage others to replicate that best practice. And it turns out that of those that are doing it well, I could pretty much categorise them into 2 or 3 kind of categories. Either they're probably American owned and therefore have picked up on this huge culture about hiring our heroes. It's sort of in the DNA of the business from that perspective. Or they're in the supply chain of the MOD. And they may not have a target, a kind of 7.5% target, but there's nothing more than good business sense about understanding the lexicon you talked about, the language, just the networks, the priorities, and being able to face into their major customer in that way. But actually, what it's in those categories, what we're missing is that there are a huge number of companies who are facing recruitment challenges and skill shortages, and just haven't, for some reason or other, found the way to connect in, both directly with the military and indirectly, to kind of, as I say, open that glass door and put out that welcome mat. So in talking to companies, what I think we've identified is some really good best practice that identifies quite basic steps that companies can take to be more armed forces friendly as employers. We've categorised those with the funding from Forces in Mind and others to really into a clear framework of steps that companies can do to take this across how they inspire and outreach to support veterans improving their employability skills, from how they hire and their recruitment practice, and then how they grow, how they support people to develop and move on once they get into employment. And we're finding some brilliant practice, from whether that's people like Tesco who offer buddies who have been in the military with anyone who joins when they come into the business when they've been ex-military, from people like Barclays who, if they know that their generic systems for HR just don't know how to calculate and interpret military skills and experience, so they buddy up with someone in the business who's got a military background to support the HR teams, or Fujitsu, who have specific assessment centres and processes designed by people who are ex-military with their HR teams to support new people and talent into the business. There's loads of examples of things that are going on out there, and I just think we need to look at how do we make it easier for more companies to do more of this and to unlock the talent that exists as people transition out.
And finally from our panel, Ed, thank you.
Hi there. Well, great to see so many people here, and it's great to partner with Forces and Mine Trust. Again, we've, as Ray said earlier, we've done a few pieces of work with them before. And I don't come from an armed forces background. I come from a background of working in government, the David Cameron trying to tackle poverty, and the CSJ set up 12 years ago by Ian Duncan Smith has been on that horse for 12 years trying to tackle poverty. And the reason we are particularly interested in this as an area is simply because if you look across the piece when it comes to tackling poverty, helping people to thrive, this issue of people within the armed services community being disadvantaged in some ways or not being helped as much as they could do comes up time and time again. We work a lot in criminal justice, and some people will estimate up to a tenth of people have a former service record of those who are inside. You look at the unemployment stats, they'll be higher if someone comes from that background. We look at the addiction, which is another area, and one stat that always shone out to me was that around two thirds of people with an armed forces background engage in hazardous drinking for men versus about 38% for the general population. So this is something that comes up across all of our work. So when we look to apply it, we find that actually the solutions that we come up with about tackling poverty generally really have to work with specific groups, and the armed forces community is really one of those. We've heard from people far more experienced and intelligent than I am in terms of how this community can be supported in the specifics. What I want to do is, for my kind of unashamedly policy wonk background, come up with just a few little tweaks or suggestions that might help make it work all the more. And I want to look at briefly three areas: work, family and debt. First of all, in work, we at the Centre for Social Justice invented universal credit, the new welfare system that's being rolled out at the moment. And whilst we're supportive of the rollout, there's one or two little tweaks that we are really keen to see made. We think it would really help with the armed forces community, as it would anyone trying to come out of one type of employment and move into another, with sometimes a bit of a jarring transition. And it's this: when somebody comes into universal credit for the first time, whenever they do get paid, for the first week they get paid absolutely nothing, whether it's they've got to pay for their housing, their home, their heating, all by themselves. When they get their payment, that first week, often people find themselves short, being pulled into debt as a result. I think changing that, getting rid of that 7-day waiting period, which when the CSJ designed it was never there, would have a tremendous effect for the armed forces community, just to make sure that transition went really smoothly and didn't push people into debt. There's the second side of things, when we've always looked at work with the piece we did for Forces and Mind Trust, for example, not so long ago, is continuous professional development, which we touched on slightly. And this is important for all of us. The world of work is changing. The opportunities and the skills needed to take advantage of opportunities is shifting more quickly than it has done in the past. But if you're the spouse of someone who's currently in the armed forces, and you're moving around the whole time, quite often you're having to settle yourself in a new place, and quite often a new employer, on a far more regular basis. Helping to make sure that where someone settles and that spouse has those opportunities to benefit from being in a job, if that's what works for their family, I think is absolutely vital. Second area I want to talk briefly about is family. We know from all of our research on poverty, and specifically the work we've done with Forces and Mind Trust, that strong families are a proven protector against many of the things we've talked about already. We know that actually if people suffer from family breakdown, it's incidents of mental health issues, especially and child mental health for the children in that family, issues of loneliness and depression can come up far more likely in those situations. And lots of the research backs that up. We held a big event with 250 people with Ian Duncan Smith and a few others earlier today, and it was kind of unanimous from everyone in the room that this is a really strong protector to help make sure that as people transition, whether it's in armed forces or elsewhere, through difficult times or big changes in their life, such as coming out of the armed forces into civilian life, that a strong family makes a huge difference to give people the resilience to make that transition. One of the things that we are suggesting, and we've made recommendations on this before, is a family test. Now, this was originally brought in by the government in 2014, and the idea of it is simple. Whenever you do any government policy, you've got to judge it against a few criteria. This family test to say, will this make it more difficult for families to stay together? Will it encourage families and help support good parenting and strong relationships? And despite being brought in 2014, it was done in kind of a voluntary way. I was partly involved in it, so I'd like to apologise at this point. Making sure that government departments such as the MOD and others really pay heed to that test could be very important in terms of making policy decisions that support strong families. The final thing to mention is debt. Now this cuts across changes in universal credit that would be useful in terms of supporting people into work in a way that meant they didn't have to rely on payday lenders and others to make ends meet during that transition period. But there's a very specific area when it comes to credit ratings. Being in the armed forces, often they don't have the credit rating that many think they deserve and have proven through the way that they've served their country, been responsible people, and managed the money that they've had well, because it's far more difficult for that community to have a number of data points that would show up on an Experian credit score. Now obviously the credit scoring, when it comes to getting a mortgage, getting a loan, is incredibly important to make sure that we get good APR rates that we can get on in life like we all want to, whether it's getting housing, using debt for other products. So changes in that area could be an interesting place to look. It's not just for government, there's a real role here, I think, for credit rating agencies. So I'm going to stop there. I just feel like in these three areas, small tweaks, and I think I very much agree with what Tobias was saying earlier. It feels like the support network is there, and these are just tweaks in the existing support network that would help make sure that it can be used more effectively by those in the armed forces community to help them to transition well out of service life and into civilian life. Thank you very much.
I suspect you could all leave and we'd probably argue amongst ourselves up here about some of the things that have been said today, but fantastic. Thank you very much to all our speakers. What I'd like to do then, we've got 25 minutes before the Minister has to go. We'll take groups of very quick, short questions of 3, please. A lady on my right.
Hello, Mary Shaughnessy. I've worked with veterans in a number of areas, and the issue is if you get just 2 or 3 people coming out a year in a particular area, it's very difficult for an employer to understand who's available, what their skills are, etc. So in a similar way to charity, is it possible that there could be a hub for employers who can say, well, I've got 3 jobs, or I will take veterans in this area, send me through who you've got and we'll speak to them and we'll guarantee them an interview. It'd be a lot simpler, and also they would spend less time on training that was unnecessary.
Lovely, thank you, sir.
Thank you. My name's Pete Bradbury. I'm the chairman of the trust, the charity Building Heroes, and it's very interesting listening in a Conservative Party forum to various speakers saying that the answer to most of the problems is to have a job, and I think that's a very Conservative way of looking at things, and one that I would fully support. And we, in the last 2 years, so what we do is we try and match up the shortage of building skills that there is currently in the UK with the fact that people are coming out of the services looking for jobs. So we train. We put service leavers and veterans on a 5-week residential training course, and then importantly find them a job or a career path at the end of it. And in the last 2 years, we've helped 150 service leavers and veterans, and it's been incredible. When someone who's been in the army for 30 years says thank you because you've changed my life, that's very powerful. So, but
do you have a question?
My question, thank you for that, is for the Minister, and the question is a simple one. Will you arrange for the Careers Transition Partnership to open itself up to new applicants again, because it's been closed to new applicants for several years, and it would be a big help to an organisation like ours to be able to have that support.
Okay, thank you very much. And the gentleman at the back.
Thanks very much, Guy Mason from Walking with the Wounded. Partly for Ed, partly for the Minister. As you touched on, veterans in the criminal justice system, a very important topic. And one of the difficulties is identifying veterans in the criminal justice system very early on when they get into the custody suite with police officers. And through Project Nova that we do, we work with individual constabularies to work out a way of identifying veterans through the computer system. But Minister, you talked about marking on driving licence. So is there a kind of national way where we can make sure that veterans always get identified without the need for intrusive questions for them? They can very easily be identified, so we can help them very early on before things get too serious in the justice system.
Okay, thank you very much for those 3 questions. I'm going to start with my right, but one around about how do you get your hands on veterans coming out, and how do you actually get to join in this thing called the Career Transition Partnership, which, if you don't know, is the MOD multi-million-pound partnership which trains servicemen and women to basically go into the wide world. And then a question on identifying veterans, very pertinent, because I actually don't recognise the 10% criminal justice figure there. So one for debate. But Tobias, perhaps I could ask you to come first, and then Catherine, you might want to chip in, and then we'll come to the left.
The organisation that looks after the Covenant, and I'm actually trying to find the name, but I'm trying to change the name, which is because I want to change the name because nobody can remember it, and now I'm asked to. And I visited them, and they're going to be really embarrassed. It's something management. It's no, it's part of the MOD, and it's the
DRM, Defence Relationship Management.
There we go, Defence Relationship Management. I mean, what if I said that to you? What does that mean? Exactly, and even the chief executive of the Defence Relationship Management went for the job not knowing what it was about. Actually, he's perfect for the job. So I want even just putting agency on the end, Defence Relationship Management Agency, gives you a better clue as to what it's supposed to do. It actually runs the Covenant. So it goes out there seeking companies to sign up to the covenant and move them from the bronze, silver and gold. So they develop the relationships with the HR departments of the various companies, many of them large ones, in order to promote the opportunities for the veterans. I've tasked them with this, is to advance their process in order to make sure that it works the other way around. So they can hear what vacancies there are, because then it can actually work two ways. How do you then actually link up the two? So we've got the agency, again, it's just advancing, tweaking, as you said. I think this is a bit more of a tweak, but nudging this forward to say, we've got a vehicle there, let's actually take advantage of it. So the covenant has only been around for a little while, as is indeed this agency, I'm calling it, and that, I think, is the direction I've told that we want to go.
I mean, I think for me, there's something very interesting about, I've had lots of employers say, I've ring-fenced a certain number of roles and then nobody applied, and or I give someone a guaranteed interview if they give it. Actually, a lot of those things are very hard to manage the supply and demand and the expectations of. So I do think, I mean, there's a lot of interest amongst the voluntary sector for a kind of internet, kind of based platform that could match people better. I think I've heard lots of those ideas. I think they always struggle to work at any scale. And I think that for me, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, but I think that there are other ways that we could try and say, how do we make this easier just for veterans, whether they're easily identifiable or not, just to get a job based on the skills and experience that they've got. And I think around that, when we talk about some of the smaller and medium-sized companies that exist around the country that might never be part of any big organisations that come to conferences and events, then for me there is a really important part for us to play with recruitment agencies and just looking actually about the role that they play of getting lots and lots of people jobs, because for a lot of people who are looking for a job, that'll be where they go, and they go down their high street or wherever they are and go to those agencies, and I don't think there's enough understanding within that system to facilitate people into work.
Okay. I think, anything about the accredited training provider for CTP, or is that a bit operational for you, Tobias?
I'd have to get back to you on that one. I think I don't know enough about that to give you a qualified answer here.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I can tell you it's definitely closed and has been for some years.
So we'll,
can you own it is the question.
I think the Minister has agreed to take that away and come back with that. Ed, do you want to talk a bit?
Yeah.
Then?
Sure, just very briefly from the question from Guy. And I think on the figure and the amount of people with an armed forces background in the criminal justice system, I think I said up to 10%, because there's a range of about 3% to 10%, and apologies for using just the highest one in a political way. The reason I mention all of that is I think it shows something we don't fully know. And it comes back to the data point when saying, actually, can we identify? At the moment, we don't fully and properly identify. The place that I think I'd start, though, in terms of looking at reform, is identification by itself is a good thing. But at the moment, I feel if you identify people within the prison system, actually are the support networks in there to make the most of really change their life and turn people from someone you're just trying to reduce their reoffending, but actually changing their lives and helping them to be an asset, taking those skills that they've learned through being in the armed forces and using them for positive use. I'm not sure that's in place as well. So yes, I think we need to work on the data to make sure it's accurate, so we know exactly who is from an armed forces background. But I think more than that, we need to be far better at using the criminal justice system to turn people, rather to stop people from reoffending, actually from changing their lives and making them assets and using their skills in a positive way.
Okay. Izzi, talk on any of that?
Yes, a little bit on the criminal justice system. It is an issue, definitely is an issue, and we've put quite a lot of work in through our covenant and our group of support officers to try to help that. It is difficult to identify those people who have got some service background, and I think they don't always want to be identified. It's a difficult time in life anyway, but I do think that it needs to be done sympathetically, and it needs to be done probably by the right people. And the one thing I would say, Ray, is that actually local authorities aren't always the best people to do it themselves, because I think there's, how many people really want to get involved with local authorities? But I think we can commission these services so much more sympathetically to support from ex-servicemen themselves who've been through, who've come out the other end, and we've certainly, you're aware of what we've got going in Warwickshire, and it's undoubtedly that paternalist support from people who have probably done 20 years of coming through themselves, but are far, far better equipped to help people in those difficult situations.
If I could just make two quick observations, again, it's dispelling myths, because when you talk about the criminal justice system, there is this perpetuated a little bit out there that if you're in the armed forces or you've been in the armed forces, you're more likely to be a criminal than your peer group. You're more likely to commit suicide if you're a peer group. You're more likely to suffer from PTSD. You're more likely to have mental health issues. Actually, this is not the case, and there's a King's College study which has been looking at this very, very carefully to look at the comparators, and we're going to be producing some statistics to show, in fact, actually this myth that went around, you may have heard of it, that more people committed suicide who served in the Falklands than actually died there. You know, that's absolutely wrong. I don't know where these came from. So we need to keep that in perspective. The second point I'll quickly make is on local authorities. Again, much more work needs to be done on this. I would like to see an award given to the best local authority in the country that meets covenant objectives. And it tends to be where there is a link. So Staffordshire has got the Arboretum, for example. So they naturally, it's in their blood, if you like, that they do this sort of thing. Bournemouth, and there's a couple of Bournemouth councillors here, grateful from my constituency. Now, we've had the air show there, which has created a massive bond and allowed everybody to be more aware, more savvy as to about what the military is all about. There are some that, you know, unless you've got a little dad's army unit or something, you know, they're not necessarily aware. So we do need to be encouraging, because often it's also the councillors themselves are retired officers, so they engage in it as well. We just need to be aware that there are different levels of that needs to be encouraged.
Good, thank you. Right, let's take three more, please. So.
I love the idea of people being mentored when they're in companies by like employees that are ex-army. I'm just wondering if there's any system that gets people mentored even before they're in a job, just like pair people with like skills in the army or even non-army with ex-army people.
Okay, thank you. On mentoring. Do you have some more questions? So.
Yes, Davis from CSJ. I was struck, Catherine, by what you said about the culture in the States being very different. I lived in the States a couple of years, we very much recognised it. And when we came back, my wife, who was the Royal Logistics Corps, made a point of going up to servicemen and thanking them for their service. And the looks she gets are utter incredulity. It is not a thing that we are good at in this country. And I'll just be interested in your thoughts on how we change that culture, because that's quite a big issue.
Okay, thank you. And so third?
Nice, that's good.
Yeah.
I'll follow up on the same. Because you mentioned you've been in Washington, Minister. I just wondered, I know New York City have a Veterans Commissioner just on that very point, and works very closely with third sector organisations to help veterans in a city-wide level. Did you bring some lessons back from Washington perhaps we could bring here? So, can we do that in Manchester, for example?
Okay. Shall I take that? We'll take the States first. And I think the point you made as well of people saying thank you. This was actually brought to me the other day when a veteran came up to me and said only one politician had ever thanked him for what he had done, and it was a visit by a politician to Afghanistan who thanked him for what he was actually doing whilst he was serving. And that politician was Ed Miliband. Now, good on Ed for doing it, but how bad it is on us that, you know, Conservatives like to think we have a good bond, you know, a plausible bond with the armed forces. And I think we absolutely should do more of it, and really thanking all of them for what they're actually doing. So that I took that away. We can learn lessons, not just from the United States, but from our other allies as well. During the summer, I held a conference with ministers veterans ministers from New Zealand, from Australia, Canada, United States, and ourselves. It was a Five Eyes ministerial conference, and each grouping got half a day to present their thoughts on a whole variety of issues. And so we compared notes, and we've got lots of ideas which are now in the pipeline taken away from that. But absolutely, as I touched on at the beginning, the practical measures in which America illustrates its support for veterans is very different, and I think it's something that we should be ambitious for. Veterans Commissioner in New York, we have to, I think the scale of that, remember we're much smaller, but we are creating a Veterans Board for which Michael Fallon and Jeremy Hunt will co-chair cross-government, so that when it comes to housing, that's local government, so that can be then linked in, so they'll be represented there. The health issues from the NHS will be represented, and of course people then look to the MOD to deal with veterans matters. Actually, much of this is outsourced, but it is in our interest because we're the ones that often do get blamed if it doesn't actually work. So the coordination of it, much as that is happening from the MOD as well. I think that was that everything?
Yeah.
Was there another one?
Is that a recognition that the Covenant Reference Group isn't functioning then, the fact that you've had to create a higher level veterans board?
No, not at all. I think the veterans, the covenant is there as that level of commitment, but you do need a body which then is able to advance and confirm, bring in new ideas and implement them.
Okay, thank you. Izzi, do you want to talk about employment? I don't know if you pick up on mentoring. No, they come to you, Catherine.
Yeah, yes, a little bit. We've got two bases in Warwickshire. We've got Kyneton, which has changed its name that many times. I'm not quite sure where we are now. We're at MOD or BED, whatever it is. Anyway, it's Kyneton where a lot of the bomb disposal training is done, continues to be done, and a big storage place. And up in North Warwickshire, well, in Nuneaton area, we have Bramcote, which is one of the Gurkha bases. And one of the challenges there, particularly, is, and of course it's been very public, is around Gurkhas who want to stay, and the community around that. And actually we're massively proud of our Gurkhas, and massively keen that they should, if they want to, stay. And it's been, you know, and frankly, we've had to go out and fight for them, particularly in the past. It's much easier now, thank goodness. But we've also got, you know, some specific areas of employers. You know, JLR is a very big employer in our area. We've got Kyneton, we've got Gaydon, and we've got one near Coventry. So, you know, they are a great support for veterans and real friends. So we have got you know, the ability to help and support them ourselves. But there are also those who don't particularly want to take that route and want other things. And in the north, we do support a veterans club ourselves as a county council. We support this veteran club, which is populated by old veterans who help new veterans coming back in and talk to them, spend time with them, and try to find out what it is their particular interest, you know, and talk them through the challenges, because quite a lot of them find the transitions are tough and they need hand-holding. Some of them absolutely sail through, but and help to reskill them. And it's that part which is actually, we don't have to be doing it ourselves. We aren't the best to do it, but we know that they are. And so, yes, we have got some mentoring going on. Probably could do more, but it's always challenging to find enough, as I said, you know, when budgets are really challenged, really difficult.
I think we should just get the community to do it voluntarily, just make it a duty of the
Well, they do, but they need some financial support. So we've given them the building. It needs maintenance. You know, it's rent free, and sometimes they need equipment and you know, some extra help, and we're happy to do that. But it's not a bottomless pit.
I mean, very briefly, there are a couple of initiatives around that do provide mentors. I can't speak for whether they're good or not, but both, there's something called the VETS programme and there's something called Transition Force. And they're both available online and match mentors, people in ex-military who are working with people who are looking for work. I do think one of the things that those programmes tend to draw on, which is again is voluntary as a network that exists, and anyone in employment, I'd urge you to ask your employer about this or just get up and do it, which is setting up military networks and businesses. They do exist sometimes very bottom up and culturally they grow, and sometimes they're more formally instigated as part of a range of networks that companies can have. But that tends to then create a focus for activity and momentum, and that's where the companies who I know who are doing the best volunteering and outreach and mentors for job seekers, it comes from their network. Back to your point, I mean, I'm a campaigner, so for me this is highly, highly campaignable. Actually, you know, how do you achieve a cultural change? It can't just be anyone, you know, it's not going to be government, it's not going to be charities, it's not going to be one organisation on their own. So I think it's crying out for some kind of big collective coordinated campaign that's highly attractive, and I think lots and lots of people get behind. It's really resolvable, I think, in terms of just lifting people up, changing the narrative about the positives of that armed forces people bring into the community when they transition out, and being able to celebrate that, recognise good practice and use that as a way of challenging people to do more. I I think it's entirely solvable. But not yet happened.
No, I mean, I think the narratives are really interesting. You know, who owns the narrative? Nobody owns it. Everybody has their version of it, but there are so many things that contribute to it. And the minister said, you know, covenants fairly new. I mean, it's written fairly new, but covenants between the nations and their fighting forces go back to the Peloponnesian Wars. You know, the earliest recorded instance of it. So. And I can remember Armed Forces days were first created, and we were dead against it because it meant working on a Saturday. It was a real pain in the backside. And I suspect, if you were honest, there's a bit of that left over. But I don't think we ever want to be, or should aspire to be, the way the Americans recognise their forces, because it's a different culture. But I think I agree with you that, you know, there's perhaps more that can be done, and some brilliant ideas. We perhaps maybe take one more question, and then I'll invite the panel just to have some closing remarks. So at the back, your hand up first.
I'm a trustee of a regimental charity, Councillor Regimental Charity. We have a full-time regimental charities officer whose job it is to manage the transition from service life into a job, to manage the 150 odd people that have some kind of a health issue, whether it's mental or physical. It works incredibly well. Actually, I think we've now offloaded some of it to the top garage, and it works incredibly well. Now, if the problem is that we're quite lucky we've got a budget to do it, most organisations do not have that budget. I don't know whether you could provide the research that would be able to turn around and say, all right, the cost of not resettling people properly is what it costs. If there was some way then to get extra budget so that more organisations could afford to have their own casualties officer or resettlement officer. I just wonder whether there's a better way to do it.
Okay, thank you. I can answer on behalf of Forces Mind Trust. That's the type of thing we are interested in, and you're 6 foot away from my head of policy, so no doubt Mary can help you. But perhaps you might just pick that up and close your remarks. And Tobias, I know you've got to zip away, so let me come to you first.
I should make clear that in my next event I don't speak at, but I am attending, and it's the Defence Secretary speaking, so it would not be in my long-term interest to not be in the audience when he's there. But what I would say, firstly, thank you for this, because again it highlights and helps me in learning more about this particular and fascinating brief, but also the complexities that we're dealing with. You've just illustrated, sir, that the role of the regiments themselves, the regimental associations, for which there are many, and they do things in different ways. My lot just get people around for cocktails, and that's probably about it. They would not venture too far beyond that. There was a shepherding program that they had, I don't know where that is now, where you would then link in with somebody who was an ex-Rifles or ex-Green Jacket, currently in the job that you want, and I think that does to some degree apply. Again, it's a local initiative done by the association, but how does that fit in with all the other stakeholders and opportunities that are there? That, I think, is part of my job, is to actually make all these different parts actually link together. It's a bit like going on the beach and you don't see much activity, but you pull the rocks up and suddenly there's lots of stuff, but people don't necessarily know about it. And is there enough money for it? That's a really, really good question, because it's actually, let's make sure that the needs are met, rather than let's say making sure all the charities actually have the money, because it's actually the people we want to help first and most. But thank you very much for including me. I very much appreciate it.
Catherine, anything else?
No, I mean, I think for me, I find this fascinating in terms of really highlighting the role that employers can play, whether they're large, whether they're small, in the mix. And I think for me, it's about how we bring that collective effort of the different actors and agencies in society towards making this an easier transition for veterans.
Super, thank you. Izzi.
I suppose I just briefly want to touch on some of the challenges for local authorities in trying to comply to the covenant and to help particularly around housing. And this has been a difficult time when we all want to sign up to this. It's really important, and particularly those areas who have bases, because you're more aware of it. At the same time, we're also, we've just been through Syrian refugees, and local authorities have been asked to find housing for them and look after children. There are a number of vulnerable groups, and who are we going to prioritise this time on? Actually, we have housing lists that are as long as your arm and longer, and it is very challenging for us to try to put forward a good support of these, although everyone morally feels this is the right thing, actually, when you're at the top of the housing list and you're not top, it's tough.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to take that point you made there, Izzi, the kind of like, who is the most important to prioritise, and change it around and say what is the most important to prioritise. And all of this is a resounding, we've had a number of events over this conference, and first of all, thank you all for coming on behalf of the CSJ. And they've all been packed to the rafters of people asking, what more can we do to help people who are struggling or disadvantaged in some way? And from all the things that we've talked about today, there's really good examples of what employers are already doing and can do more of. What mentoring schemes are happening, how it could be improved, how they could be expanded, what government might do to provide even greater focus on some of these areas. A lot of it, and the importance of changing culture within it. And I think the what comes in terms of, there is such a passion it feels within the Conservative Party and people who are interested in it, everyone who's been at this conference, to make sure that government and business care about those disadvantaged in society. I've mentioned accidentally once before, I mentioned it once more, whilst Brexit is going on, and making sure there's still a strong social policy agenda that says we care about these people and we'll do something about it. Because for me, that's what changes culture, and that's what will help these people's lives.
Good, thank you. So on behalf of Forces Mind Trust, thank you so much for coming along. If you're interested in our work,